Lecture 12, Compatibilistic Freedom.
Previously, on metaphysics, we defined the libertarian notion of free will and discussed various threats to it. Not only are certain temporal ontologies incompatible with free will, but the very nature of the universe, whether it be deterministic or indeterministic, seems to be as well. In addition, what we learned about how the brain works seems to indicate that we are not free. Not only do our decisions seem to simply be the result of our brain structure, which is outside of our control, but neuroscientific research seems to suggest that our actions are actually brought about by unconscious processes in our brain that happen before our conscious decisions occur or the conscious parts of our brain are active. But could it be that, even though we don't have libertarian free will, we are still free in another way, perhaps even a more important way? This is the suggestion of the Compatibilists. The reason that free will is usually thought to be of philosophical significance is because it seems to be required for moral responsibility. I can only be morally responsible for doing something if I freely choose to do it. Libertarians suggest that free will requires alternate possibilities, but compatibilists suggest that this may not be the case because moral responsibility may not really require alternate possibilities. If freedom is required for moral responsibility, but moral responsibility doesn't require alternate possibilities, then freedom doesn't require alternate possibilities. The most famous example that tries to establish this was developed by a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt. Versions of his thought experiment are now called Frankfurt counterexamples. The original version involves a guy named Black trying not to get blamed for murdering another guy named Smith with a brain control device. But I like to use examples from popular culture when I can, and the Christopher Nolan film Inception provides the perfect setup for a Frankfurt counterexample, so let's do that. Inception is a movie about dream sharing. The protagonist, Dom Cobb, can enter and influence your dreams and even steal ideas from them. In fact, he can implant ideas into your mind via your dreams, although this is much harder to do. But if he does it right, he can cause you to have an idea, a belief, a desire, and you will even think that you came up with it yourself. Cobb and his team do this by controlling the kinds of dreams that you have. The right kind of dream can make you come to the conclusion they want you to accept, to believe what they want you to believe, or to decide as they want you to decide. In the movie, Cobb and his team are trying to convince a man named Fisher to break up the giant energy company he is about to inherit from his dying father. To do this, they cause him to have a three-layered dream, a dream within a dream within a dream, where he comes to believe that his father wanted him to be his own person, to create for himself. He thus decides to break up his father's company. To turn this into a Frankfurt counterexample, we will have to tweak the movie story a bit, but not much. Let's suppose that, like in the movie, Cobb and his team cause Fisher to have a dream where he realizes that his father wanted him to create for himself, and thus that he should break up his father's company. But let us also suppose that Cobb's team causes Fisher to forget that dream, and that he will only remember it if he is about to decide to keep his father's company together. I'm sure you've had the experience of something happening to you in the middle of the day and suddenly remembering a dream that you've since forgotten. Let's say that if Fisher is about to decide not to break up his father's company, that will be the trigger. He will suddenly be reminded of the dream, the inception will take hold, and he will thus conclude that he should break up his father's company after all. Now, of course, if this were to happen, you couldn't blame Fisher for breaking up his father's company. It wasn't really his doing. Cobb and his team were the cause. But let us suppose that Fisher decides on his own to break up his father's company. And so he never remembers the dream and the inception never kicks in. Clearly, Fisher should be held morally responsible for the outcome of his father's company being broken up, and thus he freely chose to do so. But notice that, in the situation just described, Fisher couldn't choose to do otherwise. If he was about to decide to not break up the company, he would have remembered the dream, the inception would have kicked in, and he would have broken up the company anyway. and so Fisher can freely choose to break up his father's company even though he can't choose to do otherwise. This is a big deal because that seems to be a counterexample to the libertarian definition of free will we considered last lecture. The example shows that it is possible to freely choose without it being possible to choose otherwise. It seems that alternate possibilities are not actually required for genuine human freedom, the kind that is required for moral responsibility. Or, so Frankfurt thought, this counterexample may not actually show as much as it first seems to. Recall, the libertarian definition of free will that I said I found most intuitive last lecture wasn't simply about alternate possibilities. I said, in order to freely choose to do something, it must be possible for you to not choose to do that thing. Notice that, in the example, even though Fisher can't do otherwise, even though he can't choose not to break up his father's company, it's still the case that it is possible for him to not choose to break up his father's company. If he remembers the dream, Fisher does not choose to break it up, Cobb makes him do it. Whether the not comes before or after the word choose makes all the difference. So Frankfurt may not have been as successful as he thought in falsifying the libertarian definition of free will, at least as some people, like me, conceive of it. But still, let's consider the compatibilist notion of freedom. If it doesn't require alternate possibilities, then what does it require? The basic idea is this. As long as your actions flow out of your wants and desires, and you can act in accordance with them without anything standing in your way, then you are said to be acting freely. If you want to do something, and your action of doing it is caused by you wanting to do it, then you are doing it freely. You could be held morally responsible or praiseworthy for doing it. Notice that this can be true. You can act on your wants and desires even if you couldn't do or choose to do anything else. So, according to the compatibilists, you can be free and even morally responsible even if you can't choose to do otherwise. For simplicity's sake, let's reserve the word freedom for the compatibilist notion and the words free will for the libertarian notion. So, the compatibilists would admit that humans don't have free will, in the sense that we can do otherwise. But humans do possess freedom. They can act in accordance with their wants and desires and can be held morally responsible for doing so. However, this articulation of what compatibilists say is required for freedom is a bit simplistic. After all, a chain smoker desires a cigarette, but when they smoke one, it's not necessarily the case that they are acting freely. This has caused compatibilists, like Frankfurt himself, to make further modifications to their theory. The chain smoker may desire their next cigarette, but they also may desire to no longer have such desires. They may have what we might call second-order desires, desires about their desires. Some compatibilists have suggested that we think of freedom in terms of acting in accordance with your second-order wants and desires. This is often because our second-order desires reveal the kind of person we want to be. So if we are acting in accordance with our second-order desires, we are acting in accordance with who we want to be, and this would seem to be indicative of what it means to be free. And so the chain smoker who wants to quit doesn't freely choose to smoke each cigarette, because even though they desire a cigarette, their action is not in line with their second-order desire to not want or smoke cigarettes anymore. But they can truly show that they are free by choosing not to smoke, and successfully doing so, despite their first-order desire to do so. Other compatibilists have identified other components of our psychology which may drive our behavior and have argued that we possess freedom when we act in accordance with them. For example, John Martin Fisher has developed a version that defines freedom in terms of responsiveness to reason. Roughly put, if a decision is reached because of a process of reasonable deliberation, the action is said to be free. Of course, his definition is quite nuanced, and the debate surrounding compatibilism is very complex, but a basic understanding is good enough for our purposes. The compatibilist definition of freedom has many advantages, not the least of which is that, unlike libertarian free will, a decent case can be made that humans actually possess this kind of freedom. For example, humans possessing this kind of freedom is compatible with determinism. In fact, that's where it gets its name. Even if it is the case that every event in the universe is determined by prior causes, including all the events in your brain and your bodily actions, it can still be the case that you act in accordance with your wants and desires, or with your second-order wants and desires. Or it can still be the case that you do what you do as a result of a reasonable deliberation. You may have been determined by prior physical events in the universe to have the wants and desires you have, or even to go through the reasonable deliberation process that you did, but that doesn't matter for the compatibilists. All that matters is what drives your actions. If they are appropriately driven, then they are free and you are morally responsible for them. It's less clear if and when compatibilism is consistent with indeterminism. If a random quantum event happens in your brain and causes you to have a certain desire, and then you act in accordance with that desire, according to the compatibilists, you are free. You acted in accordance with your desire. But if you do the action merely because a certain quantum event happens in your brain, then you're not acting freely according to the compatibilists. And this is true even if you happen to act in accordance with the desire that you happen to have. According to compatibilism, your actions have to be driven by your wants and desires. They can't just happen to randomly correspond to them. But until more research on the brain determines the exact role that quantum indeterminacy has on our actions, if it has any at all, it seems to be unclear whether indeterminism is consistent with compatibilistic freedom. What about neuroscientific experiments that seem to show that it is unconscious brain processes that cause our behavior instead of our conscious decisions? Is compatibilistic human freedom possible if that is true? Again, it's not clear. I think more research and argument is needed. On the one hand, compatibilists demand that some psychological state, like your wants and desires or a reasonable deliberation, needs to be the cause of your action in order for it to be free. Since those are conscious mental states, if it is the unconscious parts of our brain that are actually responsible for our actions, it would seem that we do not possess freedom. But on the other hand, you have wants and desires even when you're not consciously aware of them. For example, it's probably true that you desire $1 million, but you weren't attending to that desire until I mentioned it just now. So perhaps, if freedom only requires us to act in accordance with our first or second order wants and desires, the fact that unconscious parts of our brain are doing all the work is no threat. And what if reasonable deliberation is required for freedom? Does that require consciousness? Does the fact that unconscious parts of our brain are doing the decision-making entail that there is no reasonable deliberation? It might. And if so, it may be hard to argue that in the above experimental conditions, the person is freely choosing, even by the compatibilist definition. But maybe that's not too surprising. After all, when someone is simply selecting which button to push, there may not be that much rational deliberation in the first place. Experiments have yet to show that activity in unconscious parts of the brain are predictive precursors to big decisions that seem to require a lot of rational deliberation, like which college to pick or whether to have kids. But the biggest problem with compatibilism is that it just doesn't seem to match our intuitions. Humans may have freedom by this definition, but the compatibilist definition does not seem to track what everyone means when they say that humans are free. When people believe that humans are free, they believe that ultimately how they behave is up to them. Nothing else is the cause of the agent's action. The agent, him or herself, is the ultimate cause. This intuition has actually given rise to another libertarian theory of free will, agent causation. The basic idea is that in order for an action to be free, the causal story of why the action occurred has to end in the agent that performed the action. Most agent causation theorists think that if it is true that the agent is the ultimate cause of the action, then it must be possible for the agent to do otherwise. This is why agent theorists are libertarians. Notice that, in a compatibilist definition, the agent could fail to be the ultimate cause of their actions and yet still possess freedom. Recall our inception example. Suppose that Fisher was about to decide to keep his father's company together, and so he remembered the dream, the inception took hold, and he thus came to desire to be his own person and create for himself as he believed his father wanted. And so he came to desire to break up the company. By the compatibilist definition, he is free and morally responsible for his action. But that doesn't seem right. Fisher's not morally responsible for his action because he is not responsible for having the desire he had. Cobb is. Cobb is the one who's morally responsible for breaking up the company in this scenario because he's the one that implanted the desire into Fisher. It might seem outlandish for someone's wants and desires to come from the outside like this, but if the universe is deterministic, whether on the subatomic level or on the level of larger objects, this would actually be quite common. The wants and desires you have are the result of your brain structure, and you really don't have control over that. Your brain structure is a result of your DNA and environment, both of which are ultimately out of your control. And this is true whether you think freedom requires you to act because of second-order wants and desires or rational deliberation. Whatever it is, it will be the result of your neural structure. But ultimately, your neural structure is beyond your control. We may be free on the compatibilist definition of free will, but the compatibilist definition is not what most people have in mind when they believe that humans are free. So now we have considered 3 reasons for concluding that humans don't possess free will: the problem of temporal ontology, the problem of determinism and indeterminism, and the problems presented by neuroscience. If compatibilists are right about what is required for humans to be free, these things may not pose that much of a threat. But it seems unlikely that the compatibilist definition reflects what most people believe when they believe that humans are free. So, if free will is a fiction, what next? This seems big, and if true, it would seem to completely change the world. And it might. The legal ramifications themselves are quite dramatic. So think about this. Imagine a world where everyone realizes that the reason people behave the way they behave is because of their brain structure. A world where people even realize that one's brain structure is not within one's control. Ultimately, their actions are the result of influences acting from outside of them that are outside of their control. So, if someone is a serial killer, we could actually causally explain why they did what they did, in physical terms. It's because of their brain structure. Given enough time to develop our neuroscientific knowledge, we could likely even look at their brain and see why they did what they did. Likely, they have a certain kind of brain malfunction that causes them to be unable to sympathize with their victims, or feel moral remorse, or whatever. And since their brain structure is outside of their control, we can't hold them morally responsible for their action. It is, in quite literal terms, not their fault that they are a serial killer. They're a serial killer because of their brain structure, but it's not like they chose to have the brain structure they have. Does this mean that, in such a world, we would have to let all criminals go? That we could never find them guilty? That we could never put them in jail? No. It means we couldn't conclude that they are morally responsible, and thus we would not be justified on moral grounds for punishing them. But if the malfunction in their brain is not repairable, we can still lock them away for the protection of society. After all, dealing out moral judgment is not the only purpose of the criminal detention system. It may not even be its main purpose. I personally don't think it should be its purpose at all. But regardless, if humans don't possess free will and thus can't be morally responsible for their actions, our justification for locking people away would likely have to be societal protection. But if our neuroscientific knowledge and surgical techniques advance far enough, we may not even need that. If someone is a serial killer, we could just look at their brain, figure out what is wrong with it, and then fix it, causing them not to be a serial killer anymore. Given such advanced knowledge of the brain, if we fix it appropriately, we can actually guarantee that they will never repeat their crime. We could even take the opportunity to refine their brains so they would never commit any other kind of crime. Once we understand that our behavior is a result of our neural structure, and we fully understand that neural structure enough to manipulate it, the possibilities are seemingly endless. In fact, we might even put me out of a job. When you learn something new, you are simply altering the way your neurons are configured. Once we understand how the brain works, we might not even have to take classes to learn things anymore. We could just upload the information or skills into your brain by physically altering the way your neurons are configured, kind of like they do in the Matrix movie trilogy. Now, the surgical manipulation of criminals might initially seem to raise some moral worries. This is one question raised by the famous Stanley Kubrick film A Clockwork Orange, based on a novel by Anthony Burgess. In it, a criminal who can't stop raping and killing is captured and brainwashed so that he never does criminal activity again. They don't do surgery on his brain, but they give him a drug that causes extreme nausea while they show him horrific violence and sexual acts at the same time. As a result, he associates the two, and so after his treatment, anytime he has a violent or sexual thought, he feels extremely sick and therefore doesn't do it. Success, the doctors proclaim. He will never commit a crime again. The movie raises serious moral questions about such treatments. Isn't there something wrong with directly manipulating someone in that way? Wouldn't the same be true if, instead of brainwashing, we were doing direct surgery on their brain? Wouldn't that interfere with their free will? It sure would, if they had free will, but they don't. The whole reason for treating them this way, instead of putting them in jail, is because we have realized that they don't have free will. And in general, if humans don't have free will, no human can be held morally responsible for what they do. So there can't be any moral worries about reprogramming a serial killer so that he is not a serial killer anymore if there is no free will to begin with. In any event, the admission that humans don't have free will would completely change our entire justice system. But the thing is, the admission may never come. Not only may the philosophical book on free will never be closed, some philosophers still argue about it vehemently, but even if it is philosophically undeniable that we do not possess free will, it seems unlikely that we will ever cease feeling free. The notion that we have free will is so ingrained in us that it seems that no philosophical argument could dislodge it, at least on a day-to-day basis. I'll admit it, I find the arguments against free will quite persuasive. Philosophically, I think it is undeniable that humans do not possess free will. If you ask me on a survey, that's what I would say. If you ask me to write a paper on it, that's what I would conclude. I don't believe humans have free will. However, when I'm not thinking about philosophy, when I'm out living my daily life, hell, even when I am thinking about philosophy, I still think I'm making free decisions. It still seems to me that I have free will. I can't help but believe I do. I even feel like I'm making free decisions right now about what words to say. I can even choose some random nonsense thing to say. Gibbledy-goo. It really seems like I freely chose to say gibbledy-goo. I can't deny the feeling and even the belief that I am free, regardless of how philosophically I am convinced that I am not. Once when Christopher Hitchens was asked if he believed we have free will, he responded, "I believe we have no choice." A brilliant double entendre. He's actually paraphrasing Isaac Singer, who made the same point. It's true, we have no choice. We are not free. Ultimately, we do not have control of our actions, our desires, or our beliefs. And one thing we can't help but believe is true is that we have free will. So you might wonder, then what's the point of studying it? What's the point of trying to figure out whether or not we have free will if we can't help but believe that we do? The answer comes, I think, in our ability to separate personal feelings from academic philosophical conclusions, being able to separate what we know is true and what we feel is true, and being able to act accordingly in the relevant situations. For example, once we academically realize that humans have no free will, we will have to repurpose our prison system. Regardless of how free we feel, and even how we feel about those who commit crimes, an argument that criminals freely choose to do their crimes and are thus morally responsible would have no legs to stand on. Even if we can't help but feel hatred towards a serial killer, we will not be justified locking him away on moral grounds. To jail criminals because they are morally deserving of punishment would no longer make sense. That's not to say that we couldn't lock them away. Like I mentioned before, we may still have to for the protection of society. But that would have to be our reason for doing so. And if we could protect society in a different, more efficient kind of way, say by reprogramming their brains so that they no longer commit crimes, that would be the preferable way to deal with the problem. That would be a different world indeed. Psychological counselors would likely have to take an entirely different approach to their discipline. They couldn't try to get us to freely choose to behave differently. Counselors would have to try to rewrite our brains to behave differently with environmental pressures. Actually, now that I think about it, this may already be what they're doing. But if neuroscience advances far enough, psychological counseling may become obsolete. Depression, anxiety, personal quirks, marriage problems, addiction, whatever you want could potentially be fixed by reconfiguring your brain. Even your weight could be managed in this way. Just configure my brain so I don't want to eat so many sweet potato fries. But the academic realization that we are not free in the metaphysical sense would not be a reason to restrict our freedom in the political sense, for restricting liberty. Even if we can't do otherwise, it doesn't follow that we should be restricted by law from doing otherwise. Even if our actions are determined by our wants and desires, and our wants and desires are outside of our control, it doesn't follow that we shouldn't be legally allowed to act in accordance with our wants and desires. After all, none of the good philosophical arguments for political freedom, the idea that persons should be allowed by law to act as they wish as long as they're not harming others, none of those arguments ground themselves in the notion that we are metaphysically free. The most famous such argument comes from the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who argues in his piece on liberty that guaranteeing citizens political freedom is the best way to ensure the most amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And this would be true even if we don't have free will in the metaphysical sense. That's not to say that political reality wouldn't be changed by the academic realization that free will is an illusion. Think about how governments would have to change the way they treat the poor upon the realization that no one makes a truly free choice that leads them into poverty. Think about how governments might treat other nations differently if they accepted that their leaders and their people don't behave as they do because they freely choose to. Might it even change how often we wage war and how we do so when we do? Think about how campaigns might be run differently if campaign strategists assume that voters do not freely choose who they vote for. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe they already are run that way. In fact, now I'm wondering, even though political freedom isn't challenged by the idea that free will is an illusion, might the idea of a democracy be challenged by this notion? Does it make sense to let the populace choose its leaders and representatives if the populace can't freely, in a metaphysical sense, do so? We'll have to save that question for a political philosophy course, but it's interesting to think about. The academic realization that there is no free will might be hard on religion. Religions usually assume that we are personally morally responsible for our actions and that we will somehow reap the rewards or punishments for our moral behavior. And philosophically, that may not make much sense. On the other hand, the personal feeling of moral responsibility likely isn't going anywhere, in the same way that our feeling that we are free isn't going anywhere, and that may be enough to keep religion afloat. Some people also worry that if we admit academically that we are not free, that it will lead to complete chaos. Everyone will just do whatever they want to do. But, of course, even if that is true, that doesn't mean that we actually do have free will. But the fact that our personal feeling of moral responsibility isn't going anywhere, hopefully that's a reason that alleviates that worry. But what will the world really be like once we admit, at least academically, that we will have no free will? I guess we will just have to wait and see. But this ends our metaphysical pursuit of the nature of persons, their minds, the persistence of their personal identity, and whether or not they are free. We shall now turn our attention to the nature of reality, the nature of the universe, and that which may or may not exist outside of it.